Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. All right, yesterday, State of the Union address. If you were here for yesterday's show, and if you weren't, where were you? But if you were here, then you know that we were looking for 3 things in the president's speech last night. Now listen, we know what these things sound like, right? It's all very bland, boilerplate, just pablum, all right? It's just political platitudes, and we're used to all that, and that's fine, right? But looking past all of that, I was looking for 3 distinct things. First thing, was the President of the United States going to say anything good about America? Now, if you really think about it, that is a crazy question. Is the president going to say anything good about the country? So I reviewed the script. I didn't find anything. Yeah, there was like, America's ready for takeoff. But like, that's not a good thing about America, right? America's rising anew. Right? Who talks like that? There's no quit in America, said Joe Biden. That's great. He said America's house was on fire. But don't worry. The government passed the American Rescue Bill. Oh, the government was here to save the day. Pay no mind to the fact that it was the government who shut down the entire economy for ever a year. Pay no mind to the fact that there's no better example of the government breaking your legs, giving you crutches, and demanding you to thank them for helping you walk again. Is there a better example of this in the history of this country? Of the government breaking your legs, giving you crutches, and then demanding to be thanked for helping you walk? Is there a better example ever? Pay no mind to the fact that this is entirely a government-caused crisis in the first place. But the government rescued us. Thank you, Joe. So yes, there's going to be a lot of stuff, America's rising again, or whatever. But was there anything in there about how America's great? Tell me that America's great. Like, give us examples of how America's great. That's weird that the President of the United States doesn't do that. To be fair, he did talk about the extraordinary leadership of Speaker Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. So, America's greatness is on their backs. I'm not exaggerating. Like, there was nothing in there. Now, you compare that to Trump's speeches, all of them. Yesterday we talked about his 4th of July speech, Mount Rushmore, but you can do any State of the Union address, and it was all just, here's this guy, here's that guy, here's this amazing thing they did, here's why America's awesome, America, blah, 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 it's nonstop. Now, that 4th of July speech that Trump gave at Mount Rushmore, New York Times called it divisive. Foreign Policy magazine called it fascist. CNN called it outrageous. This is what happens if you dare, even as President of the United States, say any good things about the country. The only good thing I could find in there maybe was the president talked about how America built a transcontinental railroad and a highway system, and we went to the moon, and we built the internet, and that's great. But then he followed it up with this.
These are investments we made together as one country, and investments that only the government was in a position to make.
So it wasn't that America's great, it's that the federal government is great. Classic big government progressive. All good things come from government. As Mussolini said, all within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Here's Kristi Noem, governor of South Dakota. She said Biden's entire vision for America is just more government. Government creates all the jobs. Government spends all the money. Government makes the decision. Nothing about empowering the independence and ingenuity of the American people. The most concerning part of the speech for me, well, actually, sidebar. So this white supremacy stuff is concerning. Here's what he said about that.
And we won't ignore what our intelligence agencies have determined to be the most lethal terrorist threat to the homeland today. White supremacy is terrorism. We're not going to ignore that either. My fellow Americans, look, we have to come together to heal the soul of this nation.
What's white supremacist terrorism? What is he talking about? I have no idea what he's talking about, let alone that being the most lethal terrorist threat. who's dying from white supremacist attack, like terrorist attacks? Bombs going off I don't know about? What was he talking about? He started off the speech with this. This is in the third line of the speech.
The worst pandemic in a century. The worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War.
He's talking about January 6th. The worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War? That is a rewriting of history right in front of your eyes. And people are just going with it. It's going to be the point where my oldest is 4. He's going to be in high school and he's going to be in the history books reading about the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War, the worst terrorist attack in America. And he'll be like, Daddy, were you alive on the January 6th Trump terrorist attack on the Capitol? And I'd be like, yeah, I was live on the TV. It was like a protest, and they went inside, and the guy put his feet up on Nancy Pelosi's desk, and they left. And then they just went back to doing the vote. That was it. Those the worst attack since the Pearl Harbor ring a bell. You tell me the riot at the Capitol was the worst attack? And here's the thing, people believe it. People believe it, our history books will write it. It was so bad that they cleared everyone out in a couple hours and finished the democracy of the day. I will never forget this report from 60 Minutes with Nancy Pelosi.
Oh, wow. Wow.
You see what they did to the mirror there? The glass was all over the place. They took
They smashed
computer and all that stuff.
I love that clip so much. They smashed it. Oh my. They smashed it. I love that so much. Oh my. Come on. On my radio show, we've talked to Pearl Harbor vets who had to jump off their ship into an ocean burning with oil while being shot at by Japanese kamikaze pilots. But they ain't seen nothing until they see Nancy Pelosi's broken mirror. Oh my. Oh. Come on. Anyway, that's an aside. The worst part for me was, again, in this whole realm of all good things come from government, was his talk about education.
First is access to good education. When this nation made 12 years of public education universal in the last century, it made us the best educated, best prepared nation in the world. It's, I believe, the overwhelming reason that propelled us to where we got in the 20th century. But the world's caught up or catching up. They're not waiting. I would say parenthetically, if we were sitting down, we set a bipartisan committee together and said, okay, we're going to decide what we do in terms of government providing for free education. I wonder whether we'd think, as we did in the 20th century, that 12 years is enough in the 21st century. I doubt it. 12 years is no longer enough today to compete with the rest of the world in the 21st century.
It can't be expressed enough how awful, atrocious, abysmal our public school system is in America today. And everyone's blind to it and makes excuses. Our kids are objectively dumber than kids from 100 years ago, just by every measurement. Go look up a reading list of kids from 1920. Like 8th grade reading list. And it's more advanced than what college kids could even read, let alone asked to read, which they're not. Kids are objectively, by every metric, dumber than kids from 100 years ago. These are kids who learned to read on dirt floors in one-room schoolhouses. 5th grade kids from back then could read better today than high school graduates. Our educational standards are abysmal. It's laughable if it weren't so sad. Adam Toledo, he was that 13-year-old boy who was shot in Chicago by the police officer a couple weeks ago. I didn't know anything about that area of Chicago where he was killed, so I looked up that area, and there was a high school right next to it. It's like Farragut Academy High School or something like that. 6% of the kids are proficient in reading and math. 6% are proficient. And proficient doesn't mean they're reading Shakespeare and like they're like the beautiful mind with math equations on the mirror, right? It's not a very high bar, proficient. And only 6% of kids made that. Talk about moral stain on our nation. And there's people who think that the solution to this is more government control over your kid's life and your kid's education. So grades 1 through 12 wasn't enough, right? Grades 1 through 12 wasn't enough. So they added K. Then they added pre-K. And here's Joe Biden last night talking about pre-K and pre-K. Want to get your kids as young as you can, and then 12th grade is not long enough, right? College administrators for years have bemoaned that nearly all their students need remedial classes just to be college ready. So you have 13 years of K through 12, wasn't enough. So now we got to add 13th grade and 14th grade. And people think that this is going to fix our education system? Standards have never been lower. Expectations are in the toilet. And then you throw on top of that critical race theory, which gets rid of all advanced classes, right? Critical race theory gets rid of grading entirely. And then you add on top of that, sex ed, transgender agenda, and all this other stuff. Good night. It could not be more clear that you should never drop your kids off at that building with these people for one day, let alone 17 years. That is outrageous that the president talks about that. And it's so frustrating and concerning that everyone's like, yeah, more school, great. Jeez. So anyway, first thing I was looking for was, will the president say anything good about about America? He did not, right? He only said the good things about the government, and the country is not our government. Progressives don't understand that. Second thing I was looking for, maybe a single olive branch to President Trump. Could Biden have said one positive thing about the Trump presidency? Right? And I'm not saying he's like, you know what, I was way wrong about Trump. He's a great guy. That's not what I was looking for. That's right. But like maybe one little passing mention about Operation Warp Speed. Right? You don't have to praise Trump as the greatest president ever, but just like a little like, hey, everyone, we hit 100 million vaccines. Amazing. Thank you to everyone involved with Operation Warp Speed over the last couple of years before I took over. You really set us up for the success that we've seen in the first 100. Like just something like that. Some little nod to the former president, but of course, there was nothing. So that was the second thing I was looking for. The third thing I was looking for was, so say anything good about America, anything positive about Trump, and the third, any rebuke to the left at all. And we've done a lot with Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he called out the South and the North, right? And then called everyone to a third higher way. That was Lincoln's second inaugural as a work of art. Did Biden do any of that? Of course not. Democrats are great in every way. They don't need to change a thing. I was looking for one little bit like, hey, conservatives, you're wrong about this, this, and this. And hey, Democrats, can you cut it out with the America's super racist thing? We are not a racist country. And we have to stop pretending like we are. We're better than this. And stop teaching our kids that they have things to fear when they go outside, right? Like some little rebuke of the left would be great. They didn't. Instead, it took Tim Scott in his rebuttal, Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, to make that point.
Hear me clearly. America is not a racist country. It's backwards to fight discrimination with different types of discrimination. And it's wrong to try to use our painful past to dishonestly shut down debates in the present.
Would have been nice to hear the president say that, right? Could have been a uniting moment. Instead, he was sure to fit in there that just to tell all transgendered kids that the president has your back. Transgender kids, you kidding me? So last night could have been an important moment, could have been a nice little turning point. Instead, he bored the nation to death. But don't fall asleep and miss the trillions of dollars in spending and the government control of every aspect of your life and the job-killing Jobs Act while you're snoozing. Take a break. I want to come back. I got 3 moments of yesterday that I hear it and I think, wow, do people believe that? And we got to debunk for the billionth time that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater as justification to take away your guns. We'll do that coming up next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. In a minute here, I want to share with you one of the greatest stories I've ever heard in my entire life. And that is not an oversell. It's exactly what this country needs to hear. I'm going to give you the short of it, and then next week we're going to tell it in greater detail. It's what Joe Biden needed to do yesterday. Literally, he could have given a 5-minute State of the Union address yesterday and just shared this story and just been done with it. And it would have been, we all would have been way better off. But before I get to that, I got a quick point I want to make. I'm very discouraged by the number of people who just believe whatever they hear because it sounds nice. Isn't that frustrating? I know I'm not the only one. I got 3 clips I want to play from yesterday, and I hear this and I think, how can people be so uncritical that they just accept this? Like, oh, okay, here's the first.
And maybe most importantly, thanks to the American Rescue Plan, we're on track to cut child poverty in America in half this year.
Who believes that? What does that even mean? Who's watching that at home and is like, oh, thank you. Thank you, President Biden. Thank goodness for President Biden. He cut child poverty in half. Why didn't anyone else think of that? I don't get that. Who's that person? And I'm not critical of Biden for saying stupid things like that. Of course, politicians say stupid things. I'm critical of people who just just believe it. They're like, oh, wow, we cut child poverty in half. That's great. Or this one.
Independent experts estimate the American Jobs Plan will add millions of jobs and trillions of dollars to economic growth in the years to come.
Who believes that? Who believes that? Who's watching that? It's like, oh, well, millions of jobs and trillions of dollars. Great. Sounds awesome. You're telling me this goes back to our last segment with education. You're telling me we're at such a desperately low level of critical thinking in our country that a president can make just a ridiculous claim like that with millions and trillions in it, as long as it starts off with, well, independent experts estimate. Like, as soon as I heard that, and I hope you did too, as soon as I heard that, I was like, oh, he's going to make some ridiculous claim. But people go with it. Or how about this one about climate change?
Consensus that we are at an inflection point in history. The consensus is if we act to save the planet, we can create millions of jobs and economic growth and opportunity to raise the standard of living of almost everyone around the world.
Who believes that? Well, people who had 13 years of government school, maybe. And for those who graduated public school, as I did, with still enough brain cells to think critically, we can't have that anymore. That's why Biden now wants 17 years of public school just to make sure no one can make it out with a brain. But alas, again, that's not an indictment on Biden as much as on the American people. Just not a lick of critical thinking. This is Biden on guns.
We beat the NRA. Mass shootings and gun violence decline. Check out the report over 10 years. But in the early 2000s, the law expired. We've seen daily bloodshed since.
Yeah, he went on, he used the line again. He used it, I forget what it was a couple weeks ago. I forget what the context was, but he said, no amendment is absolute, which is bonkers. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Ugh! Yes, you can. That metaphor doesn't make any sense. Why do people's brains turn off when they hear that fire in a crowded theater line? Knock it off. Here's the truth of that. That line comes from a 1919 Supreme Court case. Oliver Wendell Holmes, right? He was the Supreme Court justice who defended eugenics by saying 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. He agreed with a law that threw anti-war protesters in prison based on espionage, right? So you're an American, you protest a war, you're thrown in jail because of espionage. That was a terrible decision. That was overturned in 1965. But that stupid line about yelling fire in a crowded theater has survived. It's not true. You can indeed yell fire in a crowded theater. That's not against the law. Stop using, so first, it's not against the law. Second, even if it were against the law, stop using it as an analogy to take away my right to own a gun. It doesn't even make any sense. I don't, what's wrong with people? Oh, we want to take away your guns. No, you're not going to take away my guns. Well, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Oh, okay, here are all my guns. It doesn't even match up. But my main point, we got to move past that illogical framework of, this is how Biden paints it. The murder rate was high. We passed a law. Then the murder rate was low. Then the law went away, and it went back up again. Ergo, the law saves lives. This is the left has these very utopian but also univariate explanations for things, right? They do it with discrimination as well, right? They'll be like, oh, men make more than women because of this one thing I'm going to name right now. It's like, no, there's countless things that go, right? So the idea that a law did it and now the law's gone, so now murder rate's back up, it's not true at all. Now, the number of guns does not correlate to the number of murders, period. And I give a billion stats on this, but I'll just give you the one. In 2004, there were 14,500 homicides. All right, numbers are kind of tricky, so follow me. 2004, there were 14,500 homicides in the country. 2019, there were 14,200 homicides. We'll call it about the same. That's a 15-year time span, 2004 to 2019. There were 100 million new guns in America over those 15 years. 100 million new guns. If there were a correlation between guns and homicides, then the number of homicides would have, there'd be 100 million homicides. That's what the left wants you to think. But that's not how that works. It's not guns, of course. Any thinking person knows that. He's counting on you not thinking by saying, well, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And we just all turn into drones. Okay. Enough of that. Here's what I really wanted to say. And then we're going to talk about this next week as well. Yesterday on my radio show, and you can check that, you can listen to the whole interview and buy the book on my website, mikeslater.locals.com. We talked to this author of the book called Saving My Enemy. It's about Band of Brothers, how two World War II soldiers fought against each other and later forged a friendship that saved their lives. It's about Don and Fritz. Don, then real quick, as I'm telling you this story, honestly think if Joe Biden, I'm not even kidding when I say this, Joe Biden gets up there, he says, hey everyone, great to be here for the State of the Union. I just want to tell you a story. And then told this story. And then left. This is all he needed to do. And I'm being dead serious when I say that. So Don and Fritz. Don grew up as Huck Finn, fishing on a local river in Astoria, Oregon. He had, in America, the freedom to do anything he wanted in his life, and he wanted to grow up and be a lawyer. On the other side of the ocean, Fritz was in the Hitler Youth. And his parents hated it. Fritz's parents were one of the few Germans who helped the Jews. His dad saw Hitler for who he was before the rest of Germany did. But the brainwashing of their son, Fritz, was too strong. And Fritz, as a boy, hated his parents, thought about turning them in because they didn't support Hitler enough. And then, of course, grew up and went on to fight in the war. Both of these men fought in the Battle of the Bulge. They both fought against each other. They were shooting at each other. They both saw their best friend literally get killed standing next to them. When I say that is, I say literally. Here's Fritz, here's his best friend, gun blows his best friend's head off standing right next to him. That happened to both of them. The guy standing next to him got killed. They both survived, Don and Fritz, but they went the next 60 years of their life haunted by the war, haunted. The guilt of surviving, the pain of what they saw. Don said that when he looked at the bottom of his shot glass all he saw were the faces of his dead friends. The pain of what they saw and what they did. And I'll fast forward over a lot of this because I'm going to tell more of it next week, and you should read the book. 60 years later, they met each other in person in Germany. And Fritz didn't want to go. The Americans were going over, and Fritz didn't want to go, but it was Fritz's kids who said, no, Daddy, you have to go. You have to go to this and talk to these Americans. And something happened, and Fritz ended up like flipping a table, and he was walking out, and Don stopped him, and there's like this beautiful moment. But they ended up talking and telling their stories, and they became best friends. These two men have since passed, but their families visit each other. In Germany and in America, they fly across the ocean to visit each other. This is an amazing, I get goosebumps every time I've thought about it. I just heard it yesterday for the first time. This is an amazing story of redemption and forgiveness. They started out trying to kill each other, and they ended up saving each other's lives. It's an amazing story. MikeSlater.locals.com. We talked to the author of it yesterday, and you can buy the book. I bring it up because if these two men, if these two grizzled old World War II vets can find common ground, what in the world is our problem? Why can't we? And I believe we could, honestly, I do. I think we can with our neighbors. But every single external force in our country is pulling us apart and dividing us. Every single one. Politics, sports, social media, music, everything is dividing us. Everything is demanding that we only see our differences over what we have in common. Every single force in our culture, all the way to what they tell your kids in the kindergarten classroom. On the other day on the TV, on the radio, we talked about a diversity program that they have here in San Diego, and it's nationwide too. In kindergarten, they bring in Pantone color charts so that kindergartners can find their swab of color that is their skin, so that they can see their skin color and compare it to other people's skin colors. And I have the quote here this is from the lesson. Recognizing and categorizing color is a foundational skill for early grades, it's 5-year-olds, and will be used as a platform for upcoming lessons that discuss skin color. That's sick. That is absolutely sick and twisted. What are we doing to ourselves? Has a country like this ever committed suicide like we're doing right now? And I'm not even kidding when Biden could have and should have just walked out yesterday and told that story and just called it a night and say, hey, everyone, let's be more like Don and Fritz. I'll tell you, if we want to save this country, we need to be like Don and Fritz. But that can't be it or he wouldn't have done that because Biden thinks government is our only hope. You and I know better. That we look for hope in someplace other than Washington, D.C. And we can look to Don and Fritz as an example. MikeSlater.locals.com. Please buy that book, spread that word, make this story known in your family. Make it part of your family lore. MikeSlater.locals.com for that full interview. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word.
We've all seen the knee of injustice on the neck of Black Americans. Now's our opportunity to make some real progress. My fellow Americans, we have to come together to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the people they serve, to root out systemic racism in our criminal justice system, and to enact police reform in George Floyd's name that passed the House already.
What is systemic racism? Let's get to the bottom of this with our next guest, Josh Hammer. He wrote an article recently in Newsweek. He's a Newsweek opinion editor. The toxicity of the permanent outrage mentality. Josh, how are you, brother?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on.
Good to talk to you. Let's get to the basics. What is systemic racism?
Great question. Barry Weiss has a very popular Substack these days, and her Substack newsletter that rolled out just yesterday actually invited 5 or 6 people to respond to this exact question. And sure enough, there were 5 or 6 very different answers to this exact question. From my perspective, Mike, systemic racism has effectively not existed in the United States of America since the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This word seemed like it came out of nowhere. It was not in our public discourse. It was not in our national lexicon until basically the George Floyd death itself. I mean, it's been under a year that this term has gone floated around. People are throwing it around willy-nilly. And, you know, I think the left does this actually very intentionally. The left is very, very clever with the words they use. They purposely sometimes use vague terminology to kind of stretch the Overton window and overshoot the mark to thereby make what is still a solidly progressive policy look more moderate or reasonable by comparison. But the reality is that to the extent, quote unquote, systemic racism exists in America today, the closest example that I can find is discrimination against Asian Americans and Jews, frankly, in higher education admissions, which is something that the Democratic Party and Joe Biden certainly don't want to talk about. But to the extent that it exists in law enforcement or criminal justice or anything like that, it is effectively a lie. It does not exist.
Speaking of these jargon, hegemony, marginalized identities, intersections, centering, deconstruct, knowledges, normativity, like these have all existed in the confines of crazy, weird, woke majors on university campuses, but now they're finding their way to the New York Times and even the State of the Union addresses, which is problematic, to use their word. So that being said, what is outrage mentality?
Yeah, so it is deeply problematic, by the way. We're basically seeing the generation that was raised by the baby boomers now become kind of their own quote unquote public intellectuals, and all of this nonsense from the academy is now seeping out into the public discourse. It's frankly scary. But the permanent outrage mentality, and the whole point of this column, or at least that I kind of built up to towards the end of the piece, in a just world, in a sane world, people like Joe Biden, people like Kamala Harris, people on the progressive left in general, all across the country, Keith Ellison, of course, the Attorney General there in the state of Minnesota, they should have basically taken the guilty verdict, and it was a no-brainer. They deliberated for 10 hours. This was a very straightforward verdict. Let's hold aside for a moment all the mobocratic mentality and the Maxine Waters. Hold all that aside. It's a straightforward guilty verdict. So a rational response to that from the progressive left, from the people who are kind of screaming about systemic racism, would have basically been to say the criminal justice system worked. This man was found guilty of murder and manslaughter. George Floyd will never be brought back to life, but hopefully his family can, have some solace in the fact that the justice system worked out the way it did. But the point, Mike, is that that wasn't how the left reacted. They immediately basically said, they brushed it aside and said, why do we even need a trial? We all saw the video. He was obviously guilty. And then obviously the very next day after the guilty verdict, the national narrative immediately shifted to this incident in Columbus, Ohio with Ma'Khia Bryant, the 16-year-old girl who has this knife and she's lunging. It looks like she's cussing at the top of her lungs. She's lunging. It looks like she's going to stab, potentially fatally, a fellow teenager. And in that moment, she is shot to death by a Columbus police officer. And then, the ACLU of Ohio comes out here and says murder. They call the cop a murderer. LeBron James blasts out this tweet of the Columbus cop and says, "You're next, demand accountability." He deleted the tweet, but the damage was done. So the point here is that there is a subset of the population that is empowered and has a cynical, vested self-interest to sustain this toxic outrage mentality for clicks, for money, for traffic. As my friend David Azrad said in a column for Newsweek, we're in the opinion editor recently, he said, think about like Robin DiAngelo, the white fragility person. If Robin DiAngelo wasn't lecturing woke corporate human resources seminars on white fragility, she'd be stuck selling plastic jewelry on the Home Shopping Network. So there's like a whole industry that is dedicated to this now. It's really toxic though. And
they do such a good job with it. I'm impressed. Like it's extremely impressive how much Black Lives Matter has been able to take over our discourse and go into corporate boardrooms, and how Robin DiAngelo has been able to make, $10,000 an hour with these courses that she gives. Like, good for them, although it's destroying our country. Let's talk about that money part, because you have these grifters, but we also have entire systems that are set up to create this, right? So you have cable news, which is just short bursts of outrage nonstop. And then you have social media, which that's all it is, right? So how do we work against that? How do we, what's the right question here? How do we protect ourselves? How do we protect our country when we have huge incentives to live in this outrage stew all the time?
Yeah, no, you're asking kind of the $1 million question. Look, I mean, I've kind of come up with this as the backdrop of our political media culture. Just speaking personally, I can like share some like personal tips that I've tried to do. You know, I mean, I would say just a few years ago, I was very much just a part of this, right? With kind of quick, instant gratification, retweet, kind of quick, snarky commentary. I think it pays for a lot of us in kind of, you know, the talking head kind of public commentary business to sometimes just hit a slight pause button, let more information come in before we issue a hot take. Now, easier said than done, of course, because you're right, kind of the whole Twitterverse, the very nature of social media in general does reward kind of instant hot takes. But it has to start somewhere. The pushback has to start somewhere. And, you know, I personally have tried a little bit to do that. I try to fire off less kind of instantaneous hot take tweets. But it is really easier said than done because the public is increasingly just hooked on anger. And, you know, I think that we on the right have at least some responsibility to kind of step up and say, look, the left is trying to tear the country apart. They are doing that every single day. Like, I couldn't believe that. I mean, Joe Biden has used the term systemic racism over and over again, but the fact that he did so in such kind of a formal, august setting as his address to Congress last night and to the nation was really disgraceful, honestly. They are truly trying to tar this country. It's the whole 1619 projectification, if you will, of America. And I think that we have some sort of responsibility on kind of like the more patriotic right to kind of basically stand athwart and yell, stop, people from a more positive, optimistic standpoint that America is not so bad. And that more positive, optimistic message, I think, is and will be a very effective counter.
I think it will. I think people are thirsting for it. And I say you and I lead the way. Josh Hammer, opinion editor at Newsweek. And you can follow him, of course, Josh_Hammer on the Twitter. Josh, appreciate you, brother.
Thanks so much.
Have a great day. Good stuff. Keep up the good work. Mike Slater, spread the word. We've got one last thought on State of the Union yesterday.
We can actually, if you actually want to solve a problem, I've sent a bill to take a close look at it. We also have to get at the root problem of why people are fleeing, particularly to our southern border from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador.
We're on. Sorry. We played enough Biden clips. I dozed off myself. Melissa MacKenzie is wide awake. She works at the American Spectator, the wonderful American Spectator. Melissa, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you.
Not snoozing. I got my first question I want to ask you. Actually, my big question I want to ask you. Before I get to that question, I'm reading your Twitter and I noticed, I saw this before the show started, that 85% of people loved the speech yesterday. There was a CBS poll, 85% support for the speech. Wow, amazing. What's the truth behind that poll?
Well, evidently, out of the 1,000 people who were polled, 169 of them were Republicans. So everybody who's a Democrat loves the Democrats. So news, big news.
Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible? Like, but like that headline goes around. Like that's the headline. Like, and that's influential. Right? We're very social people, right? So when you hear that, wow, almost everybody else loved the speech, I guess I should too. But you find out like, what kind? That's not a poll. Like, what is that? All right, here's my main quote. Go ahead.
I was just going to say what it is a way to, it's propaganda as per usual. It's a way to push the American people into a certain direction, which seems like to be the purpose of all the news right now.
What was the big takeaway for you?
Well, my initial thought was this is the most boring speech I'd ever heard. And you know, Ted Cruz, the clip that you showed where Ted Cruz was sleeping. And at one point there was a picture of even Nancy Pelosi and Kamala Harris back there kind of yawning. And the speech was not exactly the scintillating thing that everybody wants to make it to be. And so my first impression was just, wow, this is bad. And it was to an empty audience. There was no energy. It felt like, why are we even doing this? And the second thought I had was, this guy is an old Democrat, has had years to do something, and now just wants to spend money like an old Democrat. He just sounded like an old, commie Democrat.
Yep. On that point, something very concerning was a couple times he made this idea that we are the government, that America is the government, that the people is the government. He talked about how we've built the transcontinental railroad and the highways, and we've gone to the moon, and you can only do that with the government and big government. That's a problem, this idea that we the people equals a government. Can you speak to that?
Well, this is something, this is a carryover from Obama, right? Obama talked about that, and, you didn't build that. Did you really build that? As if there, American innovation and individual people have to have the government in order to make or do anything. And so it's kind of turning every, he didn't say comrades, right? Or, but might as well. That's the idea, right? That we're all part of the government, that we're all comrades, and that we should all be pulling together and everything should be equal. And he's trying to use subtler, more deceitful language, but that's what he's getting at. And it's pernicious and un-American, really.
Yeah, it was Barney Frank. I think it's attributed to Barney Frank, who said government is just the word we use to describe the things we do together. And that is so absurd, because we do a lot of things together that has nothing to do with government at all. So what's the truth, Melissa? Like, how would you, like, if you were watching that with some Democrat who was like, yeah, government, good, we're all together, what would you say the truth is? You'd be like, no, this is who the people really are.
Well, most of the people still, although, with the Democrats, it's getting more and more share, work in businesses they've built. Nobody in the government is coming and taking their, giving them capital to start their business. No, they're putting their own life on the line. They're taking risks and using their money to build businesses, to have a life, to buy a house, to live the American dream. And in practical reality, leftists don't believe their own language. Because the successful ones don't live this way. They live by trying to get around the government, which is why you find all of these leftists, well, if you want to pay more taxes, go ahead. If you want to be a bigger part of the government, you're welcome to do so. And they never do. The solution is always the system, not the individual.
That's such a good point about how they don't live the way they say we all should. I usually look at that from a cultural perspective, right? The progressives, they talk about this, progressive culture where, monogamy doesn't matter and all these other things. But the wealthiest people are two-family or two-parent households who follow the rules, obey the law, don't do drugs, invest money properly, graduate high school, right? Like, they follow the course. And they don't suggest that anyone else do the same, and that trickles down and hurts low-income people the most. So I think of that from a social perspective, but speak to that again from even like every other perspective of their lives too.
Well, economically speaking. So like when or like another area that is a huge one is environmentally. So there's all these solutions require more taxation. They're hard on the poor, like higher gas prices. I heard a guy call into C-SPAN last night in California. He's like, for the average person who's living hand to mouth, $4 for a gallon of gas completely changes their life, because it busts their budget, right? So like that matters. If the liberals believed what they believed, like about climate change and everything else, they'd be downsizing themselves. They'd live in a smaller home. They would, want to pay more taxes, but they don't. A perfect example, you're in New York, right? And is the taxation on, the home deduction. And the Democrats want to get that back because, of course, it's killing Democrat states where they give rich people huge tax breaks on their homes. Well, they don't want to pay more taxes. They don't want to pay more property tax. They want to be able to deduct it like everybody else does. So they don't believe their own BS. They don't believe in higher taxes. They think it's going to be for someone else. So it's interesting because Biden's economic plan, it goes after capital gains, which is business investment, and basically rich people. And so it's going to make it harder for these big Democrat states if any of it gets passed, which hopefully it won't.
Or they exempt themselves out of it as well. Melissa MacKenzie's here from American Spectator. Thanks, Melissa. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Good stuff. Tomorrow is our special on gold. We're going to go right back to the history of it. We'll go back to the chemistry of it, why it matters. And as Melissa mentioned, with all the bills being passed, inflation is coming. There's no doubt about it. And we need to know more about gold. Coming up tomorrow. True story. Mike Slater, Spread the Word.